Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for making time to be with us here today in this beautiful room and wonderful building. I'm Helen Shaw from Athena Media. And on behalf of UCD Earth Institute and ourselves in Athena Media, to welcome you to this conversation. And it is very much a conversation. And in some ways, it just really, within this room, there's so much expertise and so much knowledge as well. So I'm really grateful for all the people who've made time to be with us. This event came from a conversation across the last year with myself and UCD Earth Institute through their communications team about we need spaces to talk about how we tell climate stories. We need spaces to come together as practitioners, journalists, artists, community leaders, and actually chat about what it is that moves people or engages them when we talk about the climate crisis or biodiversity loss. Margaret Atwood says it's not climate change, it's everything change. She said that over a decade ago. And maybe in some ways what we're all learning, and including coming from a background in journalism, storytelling and broadcasting, is that the facts are critical, but they're not enough. We've had the facts for decades, and many of the people that we're working with in science will sort of say, we need other tools to ensure that the facts land, that they become relevant in the minds, hearts and souls of people. Amitav Ghosh, the Indian writer, says that climate change is a crisis of culture and the imagination. And sometimes what we're trying to do is imagine into a space where we think beyond words like climate change, decarbonisation, and actually what it means to have everything change in every part of our lives. And that's really what we try to do in bringing today together. And I'm very lucky that a former colleague of mine and somebody I've worked with in RT Radio, but also through Athena Media, we made radio series together. Ella McSweeney very kindly immediately offered to come and facilitate this conversation with a very talented and skilled panel of experience, both personal experience and professional. So Ella, as you all know from her work, a journalist, a broadcaster, a writer, somebody who's a gifted storyteller in radio, television and print. But she also comes from a science background, and in some ways, TCD rather than UCD, Ella, I think, that she came into journalism, as Kevin O'Sullivan did, from science into storytelling. And Ella, in a sense, as all of us know from experience her work in television and Ear to the Ground, in radio series that we began way, way back when I was working with her, and also, in a sense, other projects, her printed columns, where she's actually bringing research and people's stories together. So I want to, in a sense, introduce Ella, but also hand over to her for the rest of the session, and also to invite people throughout today and this engagement in this lovely space. There is a lunch, there is sandwiches at the end of our chat at 2 o'clock, so do stay, but also do get involved. We've deliberately encouraged a Q&A and a question and engagement with the audience today. I know so many people in the room who have so many direct experiences of what it means to tell climate stories that land and affect humans and our own lives every day. So with that, I'm going to invite Ella to share the afternoon or at lunch, because we're now hitting that time of 12 o'clock, and actually introduce you to our panel today. Ella McSweeney.
So much. Thank you so much, Helen. I'm going to stand up here. I feel very low down there, but I'm going to return down there now in a minute. But I'm very delighted to be with you all this afternoon, and to hopefully be a small part of what will be an informative and inspiring, but most importantly, informal session exploring the power of effective storytelling to inspire public conversations around climate. And I say informal because I'm very happy to recognise some faces in the audience and some I don't recognise, but I just want to make sure that you realise from the start you're as involved with this as I am in terms of making comments, asking questions and getting involved. So just wave at me or cough gently and I'll come to you. Because the more involvement we get and the more conversation we get, the better the outcome at the end of the day. I think we all know that line, the death of one man is a tragedy, the death of millions is a statistic, which speaks to the limit, the very, I think, understandable limit of human empathy and the idea that a single relatable event is within our reach, within our imagination, and is hard to ignore. And I think, as we all know, the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis is causing immense human and ecological suffering. But most of the time, certainly in the past, it's been communicated and presented as facts. Things like 1.5 degrees warming, 450 or 420 parts per million of CO2, huge, big, abstract numbers that fail to spark anything but either confusion or a kind of shrug of the shoulders and apathy. And I was reminded, very brief anecdote, but I was reminded of this about 12 years ago. I read a piece about a farmer in Donegal, and he just had this throwaway line about, oh, the rain isn't like it used to be. And I ended up just giving him a phone, and I just said, you know, what have you noticed? And he spoke about the weather and how rapidly it had changed, that he couldn't plant his crops, that he couldn't predict like he used to be able to predict. And he couldn't be sure that they would survive the floods and the extreme weather. And most importantly for him, and actually quite upsettingly for him, he couldn't see a future for his 2 children in it, because it felt very chaotic for him at that moment in time. And yet what he wasn't mentioning to me at all was climate change or the climate crisis. And when I asked him about it, nothing. You know, he said no one was talking about it at that time. And partly, I think a lot of it was because what he heard in the media were these big alarmist ideas about what was happening in Bangladesh, or this global challenge. But what he wanted to hear was about Donegal. What he wanted to hear was about his parish, his farm, and how the crisis relates to his field. And so he asked me to tell him stories about that. And so I ended up getting a climate scientist, Peter Thorne, up to his farm to talk to him about that. I'm not sure. I think it probably ruined his life when he actually heard about the reality of it. He probably regrets ever listening the phone to me. But I think what was so interesting was just the obvious thing, which was when someone came and spoke about the story of the person and the context in which they live, it made an awful lot of sense to them and they could grasp it. There was a limited amount of understanding he could have for what was happening in Bangladesh, but he could understand the connections between what was happening in Bangladesh and what was happening in his field, because of course it is a global crisis. So I suppose we'll hopefully be able to explore some of these questions over the next hour or so with this fantastic panel. We have Jane Clarke, poet. Jane comes from a small farm in Roscommon. She now lives in Glenmalure in Wicklow. She's the author of a number of award-winning collections of poetry, with, I understand, another one on the way next year. And she's just published a book which she brought with her called The Hare's Corner, Making Space for Nature, written with Catherine Cleary. And she said, place is at the heart of my work. I can't write about people without evoking the place that shaped them and that they in turn shaped. In poetry of place, inner and outer worlds meet and find expression. Ricky Whelan is the Nature Biodiversity Officer for Offaly County Council. Before that, he spent about 11 years with Birdwatch Ireland, and he's also the chairperson of the Irish Wildlife Trust. He grew up, I gather, on the bogs. Is that correct?
Definitely, yeah.
Has a very important perspective on that. And he also has this very popular In Your Nature podcast, which brings conversations around birds, wildlife and wild places to our ears. Treasa De Loughry at the end is a lecturer in world literature in the School of English, Drama and Film in UCD, and she co-leads the climate research strand at UCD's Earth Institute. And she also has grassroots experience through energy transition projects, working with communities on the ground, which hopefully we'll hear a bit more about. And finally, Kevin O'Sullivan, who is the Environment and Science Editor in the Irish Times, came into journalism in the 1980s with a science degree, which I presume back then was very unusual. And he went on to be the editor of the Irish Times and then became the Environment and Science Editor at a really crucial and important time, both politically and scientifically as well. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing what they will have to say. We've asked everyone to open with 4 minutes, very precise number, 4 minutes, answering this general question, which is, tell us about how we tell climate and environment stories that motivate and inspire the public. So there's microphones in front of you. Treasa, we'll start with you. Please turn on your phone if possible.
Hello? Okay, can everyone hear me? So thanks for having us today. When I was asked
come and speak. I thought to think about my own personal experience in relation to climate stories. And a lot of them were about absence. So a lot of it for me, I think unlike some of the other people here today, I grew up in Dublin, a very urban environment. So when I think about how it is I came about to teach the role, teach the literatures I teach now, where I often teach global eco-literatures to students in the School of English, Drama and Films. I teach stories about ecological crisis, climate change, pollution, degradation. Students always tell me how sad these stories are and how they want more hopeful stories. And I sometimes teach students on the sustainability degree as well. And they come through different pathways like science, policy, law, commerce, and so on. And like, how did I end up in that line of work? And like, kind of a question mark for me too. I grew up in West Dublin and nature was just absent. Like nature was the place where antisocial behaviour happened. And it's only through my academic training that I begin to see that the kind of unloved brambly pickets at the back of the house in the stage, or those grassy verges on the side of the M4 are as much a part of nature and human transformed nature as the kind of bucolic landscapes that we often celebrate in Irish literature and culture. And my academic training by reading the work of people like Timothy Moore, Donna Haraway, and Jason Moore has given me the vocabulary for that too. But also engaging with the work of authors like Kim Stanley Robinson or Margaret Atwood, kind of people that you're familiar with as well, who often write in a dystopian vein, but are doing so to raise kind of critical awareness and consciousness of what we can do in terms of climate action. So Kim Stanley Robinson, if any of you have read his work, like he's not kind of he's not wallowing in the misery like writers like Paolo Bacigalupi are, right? So if you've read The Water Knife, and Paolo Bacigalupi, an American sci-fi writer, like he writes that he wants to inspire anxiety. He wants to inspire dread. And there is a place for dread in dystopian. We can talk about that in terms of narratives of climate crisis. But we also need narratives that are about kind of system change, as we heard earlier, that are about action, that are about the step-by-step process through which we change values, that we change perspectives, that we change priorities too, that our societies maybe aren't so much around consumption or growth as they are around sustaining nature and creating more holistic human-nature relations. So we need different kinds of stories that create these different kinds of imaginaries. And there's lots and lots of ways into that conversation around genre, and we can talk about them later. But I'm very conscious that we have a responsibility to young people, we have a responsibility to our undergraduate cohort who I meet on a daily basis to not overwhelm them with stories that are just effectually really difficult all the time. You know, our students are being presented with narratives of crisis and collapse in terms of economy, housing, job opportunities, society, as well as climate. So we have to think very carefully about our responsibility to young people and how we bring them along in the discussion, and again, how we present them with hope. And I always say that literature and culture, they're not recipe books, right? Genres are slippery categories. Literature and culture, they're not recipe books for political change or societal change, but they can at least put the seeds of transformational thought out there. The final thing I should mention, I'll probably come back to it later, is that I've kind of been thinking about how these narratives go out into the world, right, that go from the page into communities, and using a broader definition of narrative. So again, my corpus is like novel, poetry, like stories, those are the things I work with and teach every day. But we've been running a project funded by the Earth Institute with a couple other colleagues where we look at narratives of energy transition in communities that are experiencing the past, present and future of energy transition in Ireland. So running kind of community mapping workshops in Kilrush, so considering the energy transition at Moneypoint, in Tala in West Dublin, where there's a pilot of a district heating scheme that's tied to a data centre. And we're going to go to Galway soon and talk to the community around Carna, where there was discussion of an offshore wind farm. And we're going to think about, again, past, present and future of energy transitions in these communities. What are their understandings of energy narratives when we use terms like just transitions or sustainability? What do the communities understand by that? How do past narratives of energy transition, inequality, energy poverty and so on feed into community understandings of these terms? And we find that they're often in friction with perhaps like the top-down narratives and messages that these communities often kind of handed to them through policy, for example. So I'm happy to talk about that later.
Super, thank you so much, Ricky.
Thanks, Ella. I'm going to shoot from the hip. I didn't prepare because the various jobs and roles and things I've had over the years, I've always had to pivot depending on the audience. And I think that's important about it. Your audience is important, who you're speaking to. And myself and Niall in Birdwatch Ireland, we started the Internature podcast during COVID because we had to pivot to find a project that would work and we could get our message out and not be in a room with people or the field or wherever it might be. So that's when we started. Our first episode was Birds in Lockdown, it was called. It was about how we were finding some sort of solace during lockdown in the birds in our garden and in our local areas. And that's where that went. And people sort of can tune into that as they please. But often you're preaching to the converted because nature people will find a nature podcast. So sometimes you have to bring your message to the people you don't naturally sort of see eye to eye with maybe, or they don't accept your message straight up. And I suppose through projects we've done, I think the best way to tell a story is to demonstrate first. And it's very difficult to look a man in the eye, and I'm down in the bog, and I'm definitely reared in the bog, to tell a man or two men, a father and son, that they now have to re-wet the bog that their granddad spent 100 years trying to turn into a farm. And that is a very difficult conversation to have at the get-go. So that's not how you do it, or that's how we have been doing it, and that's why we haven't got it anywhere. And I'm really disappointed with just transition so far, and we can tease that out. But I've always told, what I didn't realise I was telling climate stories, because I'm a bird guy, as Ella said, I was with Birdwatch Ireland, I was with the RSPB in the UK before that. So I cut my teeth in bird reserves and in the bird. And I found myself telling people stories about, for example, brent geese in Dublin. The brent geese, they migrate back to eastern Canada, and they breed there, they rear their young. They then are flightless for a period over there, and they move to sort of safer bays in eastern Canada, and then they migrate back as a family group. They bring their offspring with them. It's really nice, but really, and they come back to Dublin. And in Dublin, they allow humans to get really close to them because we don't hunt them here. They're tasteless and they're tiny. We've never bothered, so they're not afraid of us. But there was a Brent Goose Ambassadors project we had years ago, Birdwatch Ireland and Dublin City Council, and people were not getting the message about keeping their dogs in the lead in Bull Island. And we're trying to figure out how do we, the signage wasn't working, warnings weren't working, the MPWS wasn't working, the hares had vanished off the island, it was a disaster. So we said, let's make the kids the ambassadors. So brought the kids out from inner city schools, from all the schools around, the affluent ones, everything. But we would teach the kids the story of brent geese, how they're really well bonded as families. We'd show them the chicks with their parents and tell them the problems they had with dogs. And the problem with dogs was that when your dog's Tiddles runs across the salt marsh, that brent goose and his buds and all 500 of them could be only back from Greenland today. So they've so little fat and reserves that literally that last chase of the dog is the one that sort of, it's the straw that breaks the camel's back. And you think you're the only one walking dogs in Bull Island, and I tell you, if you stay there for an hour, you're not. And that's the problem. So what we did is we told the kids a story, we told the kids about how dogs should be kept on leads. And within seconds, without sort of prompting them, the little kids, and it's funny, I shouldn't do the accent, but I will. They were walking up, they were confronting Doug and going, hey, mister, get that dog on a lead, right? And you go, and I thought this was class. And then they were doing the project. They were going home to their parents, they were going home to their grandparents, and they were spreading the message for us. And it's very disarming when a child tells you the story rather than some guy with a degree or a master's or a PhD. It's a much different conversation to have. And there's loads of those stories. I mean, you know, the other one is, of course, is short stopping in Hooper swans. And Hooper swans no longer, we used to think that, oh no, what have we done wrong in Ireland? Why aren't the Hoopers coming to our wetlands anymore? It wasn't, they didn't need to come here anymore because there was enough vegetation now that was no longer covered in snow where they overwinter. They could stay there, there was no bother, the trip, it was risky. And I didn't realise all these years I was telling climate stories. And I'm the same, I've been disarmed by climate, like everyone else has. It's a very difficult thing to confront. But if you tell it through, I've been telling it through the animals, basically, telling their story, and then by extension, telling the climate story. And that's how I've been doing it. And I finish with one personal anecdote there. I was chairman at Offaly Bog for a decade, and I grew up in the bogs and foot and turf and sail and turf and all that sort of stuff. All my uncles, aunts, everyone, granddads, all the rest. Spent my summers on the bog. I used to hate the bog. And it's a lot of work to bring home turf, I can tell you that. And then being chair, it wasn't right or credible for me to be chairman of a bog restoration project and have a shed full of turf at home So, but we were still kind of, me and my wife were in sort of, we're a young couple, we hadn't got a whole lot of resources, so we were kind of in a bit of what we would call, I suppose, fuel poverty. So we couldn't shed, we couldn't fill it in oil tanks, €1,000 worth of oil, we didn't have it. So we were still burning a bit of turf. And I weaned ourselves off it over a couple of seasons, and that we no longer needed turf. But then I got ill and I had to spend a bit of time in hospital. And when I got home, my uncles had a shed filled with turf. And then we had this big shed full of turf. And I had to sneak the turf into the house. I thought the Leinster Express was going to do an expose on it. So it never happened. That's my perspective, and we'll tease it out.
Thank you, Ricky. Kevin.
Thank you very much. I'm going to put the chase as well, because you know, I'd love to be writing about climate solutions all the time, and it'd be better for my mental well-being, you know, because you know, I invariably fall back into writing about, oh, Ireland's emissions are still going up. We're facing 26 billion in fines. There's more extreme weather events on the way. And by the way, polar regions are melting at 5 times the rate of other parts of the world. But I have to factor in the scenario where there is an onus to report and analyze. And that's especially in the context of the risks and climate tipping points and exceeding planetary boundaries, and what's been described as the urgency factor. And that bell has to be rung first instance, and that's on the journalism side in particular. And I have this sort of recurring nightmare that there is going to be a day of reckoning. And the big question will be asked, what did you do to highlight the polycrisis of climate, nature loss and pollution? And you know, it will come from unexpected sources like your grandchildren, and it will apply to individuals and big corporations as well. But like I can read how our readers respond, so I know there's a critical need to show a way forward to articulate how proven solutions can be applied in terms of cutting emissions and adapting for what is inevitably going to come. So we do try and sort of pivot to do that, and to do it not just in terms of a big corporation or the farming sector, but every sector and every level of society in Ireland. But equally at the background of all of this, I think we really have to, you know, acknowledge the current reality and the risk of runaway climate change. You know, it is awful and it is scary, but we do have to sort of factor that in. And you know, that I can point to 1,000 things within the next half an hour if you want to indicate what the science is saying. And probably the one thing that really jumped out at me in the last 48 hours is that Copernicus, the EU climate service, said that there's too many parts of the world now that are actually at 2 degrees plus. And that, you know, if you go away and do your analysis of how we can survive in a 2 degree plus world, that is such a dark place. I think the background, again, it's not straightforward, unfortunately, in terms of trying to pivot. And there is a failure of communications because it's very clear that the call to climate action, meaningful climate action, hasn't been heard. And we have to face up to that reality. Because if we had done that, you would see that that decarbonisation is happening at pace. And instead of emissions rising and more fossil fuels than ever being brought into the system and ramping up in key big economies. So unfortunately, there's additional complicating factors as well, and that is, you know, these channels that we're all in and consuming and looking at and hearing are really contaminated by misinformation and disinformation, and you have the obvious scenario where Trump is emboldening the bad players, that climate denialism is reasserting itself, that climate delayism is another little monster that's lurking towards the side of all of that, and that Trump is, as you all know, engaging in a revenge policy. So he's scuppering big renewable energy projects, which, you know, economically just hard to reconcile, whether it's a wind farm off New York or a battery farm in the Midwest in the US. And then you have the climate doomism, which is an awful affliction. And then you have the real climate anxiety, which is concentrated in younger people. So that's all kind of impairing the message or the empowerment that's necessarily required. And we're joined by Hans somewhere here, but he's also highlighted recently in an article in the Irish Times about the lack of understanding, that persisting lack of understanding that we have to reconcile. I'm just going to quote because I think it's a fantastic quote. And he said, at its core, our failure to take effective measures to halt climate chaos is caused by a fundamental lack of understanding of how our health, happiness, and prosperity are entwined with a healthy environment. And I think he couldn't have summed it up better. So just to quickly pivot to the happier bit. People want more urgent climate action, and it's incredible how polls show that, not only in Ireland, in Europe, and even in the United States. So that's something that we just have to build on. And I've spent a summer looking at entries into the Irish Times Green Spaces Award, and I was unbelievably enthused by what's happening at a local level. It is quite remarkable. It's understated and yet it's meaningful. And this is in remote rural areas where there might be just a village of less than 190 people, or it's in inner city Dublin. But it's across the whole of Ireland and in every county. And in many instances where it's possible, they're really embracing renewable energy and doing it at scale. In many instances, they're restoring nature in a really meaningful way. And it just brought home the message to me that building out locally works. And it takes immediately the engagement, an engagement in the conversation. And dare I say, it illuminates that doomism that I was talking about, the helplessness and the anxiety. And we can talk about individual projects, but the one thing that really struck me is the scale that's achieved, say, in somewhere like Dingle Peninsula. And then, why isn't that applied to every community in Ireland or every region of Ireland? And then equally in bog restoration, which you touched on, it's quite remarkable the extent to which communities get the need to have meaningful bogland restoration and how it's beginning to take root. And I agree with you, by the way, on the just transition and all that. I think that is a particular issue that has to be resolved with a better form of communications. So sorry, I probably broke my 4 minutes, but anyway, just to reassure you, we do tell those stories of empowerment, and people like Captain Cleary and others who we were talking about it, she just does it so brilliantly, and there are others, but I would say, looking at standing back from that, it has to be scaled, and not just in our outlet, but in other outlets. And I think there's two other things that need to be added to the mix, and that is a creative arts input that Helen has written about so compellingly. And we need scientists more to participate, and every form of scientist, and not just the preachy ones. We need everyone to start to say, look, this is how I see it, this is how we can do it together. And I think I have a very simplistic end point, and that is that watching all this climate action and all that, I think it's the key element has to be about raising your voice as an individual and raising your voice collectively. And it's very simple, but I think it's how to progress matters. But I still go back to the journalism. You need a hard edge with it as well.
Thank you, Jane.
Thanks very much. When I was thinking about today, I was thinking what makes a story that will move people and that will be memorable. And that's what I'm trying to do every single day in writing a poem. How do I make it moving? How do I make it memorable? And the things that do that are as specific as possible, because it's in the specific that the universal arises. So like Ricky's story about the Brent geese, immediately I'm thinking, I want to know more about that, so that's one thing. The other thing is, how do you create pictures in people's minds? Because it's the pictures that stay with people. And then how do you use language that creates music? Because the music is what conveys the emotion. And the emotion is what we remember. We remember the emotion that was evoked in some of the stories even already told here today. And that's what leads to change. So the other thing that I want to say is, how do we use all the senses? You know, how do we use touch? How do we use smell? How do we, you know, all those senses, how can we use them in conveying our stories? And of course, that's what I'm always trying to do every single day. But I think that's what other good storytellers are doing. I also wanted to say that I sometimes get this, I get commissioned to write poems, and there's a tendency to be told, let's go for uplifting. And I just want to say, loss, fear, hopelessness, it is the reality, as people have already said here today. It is. But I know, with my background in psychotherapy, but I also just know as a person that when we get to express, you know, when you're talking to a friend and telling them how you really feel about something going on in your life, that's what helps you take the next step. So not to be afraid of exploring and really talking about those things, but also letting it in a way that we can process it, in a way that we can engage with each other. Obviously, it's not about haranguing people. It's not about preaching to people. That doesn't create change. And the other thing I want to say, that in my experience, I think a lot of what I do as a poet is bear witness to what other people are doing. So, for example, like when I said the specific, I'm really interested in bog restoration like other people here. But it's not just any bog restoration. It's Barnacullion Bog, which is near Tonlegee and County Wicklow. That's what you need to hear about. And you need to hear about Hugh McLinden, ranger with Wicklow National Parks and Wildlife Service, who's going up there every day, sloshing up through the rain in his Wellingtons with volunteers from Mountaineering Ireland and Rewild Wicklow. And it's those stories you need to hear. And so when I say witness, I think the fact that I wrote a poem about Hugh's work, Hugh has told me that poem has helped him feel encouraged, has helped him feel that there's meaning in his work beyond what he's doing every single day, which can feel so hopeless. And that is the reality for people who are doing this work. We have to be able to say that. And the other thing I want to say is, I learn so much from the scientists. I learn so much from, you know, all the activists, all the farmers who are trying to do things differently. So I feel that it's partnership work, it's collaboration work that encourages me to write another poem. You know, so, and the last thing, just as an example, this week, somehow or other, I came across a video where an ecologist was talking about Ladies Island Lake in Wexford. Loads of you will know about it. And he just said the lake is dead. And it just went through me to think of a lake being dead. I mean, you know, it feels really emotional even just to say that to me. But that's what then started me to try and write a poem about this lake that's dead and all that lives on it still, that is still there, but that, you know, is only just hanging on. But that's because that ecologist put it in that way. He could have said it in all kinds of different ways, I'm sure, about phytoplankton and algae and all that, but he just said it in that way. And I think that's where our stories come from. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. There's a mic there.
Yes.
Kevin, I just wonder what the goal here is. I mean, had the world looked at this 20, 30 years ago, when you started out in journalism, in a more story-led way, what in the best case scenario could have happened differently?
Well, I think we would just be, 20 years further down the line to bringing the planet to a safe place. If we had acted, say, around 1990, the Kyoto Agreement, all of that, like the science was clear at that point, but I think we were this sense that it was a tomorrow problem, not today, and that lingered for far too long. And then I think the obvious economic might of certain countries reasserted itself at every turn. And I think fossil fuel industry will be shown in time to be most colourful in terms of the black propaganda that took hold, that's reasserted itself. So I think, like being a scientist, it's obvious that if you took the set measures at the right time, you would have progressed it. So we would have had lower emissions. We would have had less strain on ecosystems. We would have began the process of nature restoration a lot quicker. And let's be honest, nature restoration is at a very early stage, not only in Europe, but in Ireland. We have a land use policy that is facing the wrong direction. So I think, you know, there was obvious measures. It wasn't sort of pie in the sky in terms of solutions. It was obvious measures to be pursued. But because what I was referring to earlier as runaway climate change, our ability to control that is weakened. And that's the real tragedy.
But I'm trying to work out whether, to what extent 30 years ago, storytelling would have led to quicker action. Is it your belief that when we tell stories, I mean, I think to a certain extent we saw it with the abortion referendum, where women and men were prepared to come out and tell their stories, and you couldn't look away from what they were saying. So there was no amount of data that you could have thrown at that. That it was the point at which women and men came out and spoke, was the point at which people couldn't look away and had to challenge their own beliefs and their own feelings about what happened. And as we know, it passed. So I just wonder, with climate and nature 30 years ago, do you think greater storytelling would have led to more action?
Personally, it would have. And if we were deploying the art, well, from what you've described, most definitely. But if you look at the Irish Times, for example, Frank MacDonald was the only Irish journalist that was going to the COPs. He was regarded as almost eccentric, and the Irish Times had a strange faith in just sending him to the most part of the world for climate every year. Michael Viney was writing, and there was someone who was telling stories, and he was telling a story that was so compelling. And actually, if anyone had heard him on BBC Radio sometimes, his description of nature was just breathtaking. And like, you know, it was a real sort of catalyst for change. But that was almost marginalized, I'm afraid. And there was other organizations that were very committed and trying to ring the bell and trying to tell the right stories. But I think as in the abortion referendum and marital rights, it was when it moved up a notch in terms of frankness that made people sit up, like in terms of the inequality. And I genuinely believe myself, it's only in the last few years that people are getting brutally honest about the state of the planet. I used to think certain climate columnists were a little bit fanatical, actually, you know, in terms of the need for change now.
They look mild looking back on it.
Yes, and yeah. I'm now in their camp, to be honest.
Yes, yeah. Treasa, can you talk a little bit about I mean, it strikes me that stories are a space that, to a large extent, it's not controversial. Stories are subjective, they're personal, they come from within. It's hard to argue against someone's story. You mightn't like it, but it's a space, it feels like quite a safe space to be in. And the power, I mean, in much as I've asked Kevin, what do you think the power would have been? I mean, it's a kind of thought experiment looking back 30 years. Had things been communicated differently? Within that, what currency do you think storytelling could have had?
Yeah. Like, it was interesting chatting with Jane earlier. Like when I finished my PhD 10 years ago, I remember thinking, oh, it'd be great now to teach a module on like CLI-FI. So CLI-FI is this term for climate change stories that was coined in 2008 by Daniel Bloom. It's been popularized ever since. And there really weren't that many like mass literary novels that I could turn to. So actually, in terms of resources, like how would I put this module together? What text would I put together? Are they easily accessible for students to buy? All these concerns I have in putting a course together. Like, it just would have been really challenging to put that course together. Whereas now there's an abundance of stories. And obviously I teach world and post-colonial literature mostly, but in terms of world and post-colonial literature, but also the Irish literary scene, there's lots and lots of resources to go to now. It's a much easier proposition. And the students want these stories too. Like I teach big modules, first year, second year, lots of modules in third year teaching this kind of material now. So there's a huge appetite there. Well, how would things have looked had there been more climate stories? Like vastly different, right? Because we're talking about like a plenitude of stories. So we're not just talking about what I deal with, which are like big chunky blockbuster novels, but we're also just talking about grassroots stories, and that's what we need more of, right? In terms of normalizing feelings of loss, normalizing genres like elegy, nostalgia, melancholia, solastalgia. That's a new word that's been coined to express like a feeling of loss, nostalgia people have in relation to huge crises and transformations of their landscapes, right? How these things are consolidated in narrative form to normalize these to the extent where there's a growing urgency and I guess a consolidation around the need for change, right? Around climate action and climate inaction. How does this happen? So I teach students in creative industries as well. And what we need is more resourcing as well, right? Because we're talking about grassroots stories and narratives, and that's great. But we also need poets like Jane who go out and talk to those farmers and talk to them about how to shape stories and talk to them about how to put words to that, right? There's a craft to writing too, right? And there's a craft of putting stories together. And that's not innate. So how do we do that? We need to properly resource the arts. So we see in Creative Ireland now that they have, they're putting money into creative communities initiatives, and some of those are around kind of climate communities, and they're trying to resource grassroots organisations, communities to produce creative work and narratives around climate stories. And there was €2 million in some of the last rounds of funding, so it's a decent amount of money, right, for an area which is really under-resourced. So artists are precarious, a lot of them are freelance. We need more of that too. We need longer term funding around the arts as well, right? So when we're talking about climate crisis and environmental crisis, it's not just funding everything we need to do around that, right? We need more scientists, we need more rangers, we need more conservationists, but we also need people who know how to tell those stories, right? Who know how to put those stories together, who know how to put shape on narrative, who know how to communicate to audiences, who know how to persuade, engage, excite people. So we need all of that as well, and we can't just assume that artists are going to pick up the vocational baton and survive on air and somehow do that too, right? You can't eat a poem, as poets like to say. Yeah.
Ricky, I just wonder, I mean, you know, it's an obvious thing to say, but facts aren't enough. But we saw that with Trump's first election, where, you know, people were looking and thinking, my God, like, there's no amount of data here that's going to change people's minds. People come from a belief, and they can believe in things we all do that might be completely wrong, but that's where they come from. And it's their trusted circle, the peers that are the biggest influence for them, not a list of facts and all the rest. For you, how difficult is that to work with? Because I know environmentalists, ecologists who just can't fathom and get over that step of accepting that people are unmoved often in the face of the data.
Yeah, and when I first moved back from the UK and joined Birdwatch Ireland, I became very anti-farmer. And it's because you see them as the root of all evil. They're not doing what they're with the landscape, what birds need to be done. And then and almost it was almost massaged, this us and them sort of IFA versus the NGOs. And it was only with sort of the Burn Bio and movements like that, and that actually got conservationists, people like me, into rooms and into fields with actual farmers instead of talking at each other online. And that has actually really brought on the agri side of things. No end. And I would say, like, it's the Burn Wintridge is one of the, should be celebrated as one of the best conservation breakthroughs in the country. And all the things that have sort of stemmed from that. And we're still making mistakes. The other thing is, well, people only listen to their own in many senses. So, like, if I'm trying to do something on hedgerows, I'm trying to get it in Agriland, I'm trying to get it in the Farmer's Journal, because that's what they're reading. And if it's on their publications, they kind of already accept it. At least the door's open, they'll read it. If it's in the Wildlife Trust magazine, they're not reading it. And if it is, they feel like it's loaded, it's Pádraig Fogarty saying it's not. Do you know what I mean? And so there's a trust to be built, and we spent a long time destroying that trust, and now we need to build it up. And I think conservation side of house is probably guilty of not putting their hands up and saying, we got this wrong. And you're not the bad guys, and we understand where you're coming from. And I see it, especially when I moved to, like, I left decade in Birdwatch Ireland, and it was in that sort of echo chamber. Now I'm in Offaly County Council, a rural council, and now I'm trying to convince engineers who think they can solve everything with concrete. So I'm telling stories differently now and again. So I'm trying to give them projects that they like to get their teeth into, that they can use a little bit of concrete maybe, but not, but they love projects. So now I'm trying to design projects that will be good for nature and keep them busy and from ripping out hedges all over the place. And I have a real problem with the, it's funny, it's funny for a biodiversity person to have a problem with anything that's good for the environment. But this race to climate action is actually destroying parts of our environment through ripping out hedges for these bike lanes all over the place. We're running motorways down our canal paths. Like, it's actually, nobody's talking to each other. And I don't want to keep blaming the policymakers, but if, and Kevin, I'll tell you, like, if policymakers were strong 20 years ago, without the question you asked them, all of this would already have found its way through. And it's the policymakers that are not letting it, because it's risky. It's risky putting yourself out there as a Fianna Gael or Fianna Fáil, say, actually, lads, yeah, we are going to flood the bogs. Yes, we are going to do this. Because it goes against their base, and it's risky.
What has been in your work in Offaly, but also in Birdwatch, and you have your successful podcast, what has been the most effective thing that you've been involved in when it comes to storytelling, where the public, you know, like meerkats, put their heads up and looked your way and actually heard what you were trying to say?
Exactly what you said in your opening remarks is that people want to hear about their story, their area, their thing. So we have 60, 70 episodes, 60-something episodes, and the most popular ones are the ones that are about very, very definite places. Like, well, I'll give you an example. The ones that we do about, we've done one about beaver introduction in the UK. Well, it's one of the best episodes, I think the best. It's got one of those stats because it's England. We're sick of hearing about examples from England. We want to hear about examples from Roscommon. Why can't we stick beavers in Roscommon? For reasons we haven't important. But that's the ones they want to hear. And it's like anything. It's like almost we've never told that big spout story on the podcast because people are sick of hearing about topics. That story's been told by all of you guys 100 times, and not only that as a criticism, but so it's the little bog that needs a bit of a leg up. That's the story people want to hear, and that's the story they want needs to be told. And so there's a good bit of that as well. And it's funny, and I'm saying I'm disappointed with Just Transition. The worst thing that ever happened in Border Warren's history was giving Aberdeen's bog that lease, because now every community group wants a little bit of bog everywhere in every county. And I'd say what would be a land manager, land agent, heart is broke with emails from Mary saying, why can't we have that 10 hectares of bog that we on boardwalks, we want this. And the community is the best place to put it, you know, give the ownership too, but at the same time, we could have one of the most ambitious wetland restoration projects in the world, not Europe, not Ireland, if Bord na Móna were mandated to let that happen. But in a minute now, they're pretending to be a renewable energy company. They're not. The original mandate was to get turf out of the ground, to get us out of an economic crisis and get fuel into those fires. And that day is gone now. So, but we pivoted and we decided to make them a renewable energy company, which could be part of their business, but I think really what they should be is a national rewetting agency. But I know how well that's done.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Jane, you spent many years, if I'm right, working in psychotherapy, didn't you, in St. Vincent's? Is that correct?
Well, that's where I trained.
You trained there.
Yeah.
I just wonder, you know, most people, I was reading John Gibbon's new book, Liveland, and he said most people are concerned not about the end of the world, but how to get to the end of the month. You know, and I think that is so absolutely understandable. Who wants to be concerned about the end of the world, even if it is in essence what we are arguably potentially facing with the depth of the crisis that we're in. But I just wonder, how important is it to tap into people's needs and desires, and where does hope come into all of this? Because, you know, fear, like we saw in COVID, can make people act, and it can force people to act in a certain way that you want them to act. but we need hope too,
Yeah,
and
well,
buckets of it. So.
it's funny because what I was thinking this morning, hearing Simon Harris talking about Palestine. And I mean, I totally support what he was saying about Palestine, but I think he is partly doing that maybe from his own morals, but also because he hears this groundswell from Irish people. He knows this is something that he needs to have, but he's not getting that message about climate about our land from Irish people, about biodiversity from Irish people. That's what I think is the question. Why is it, like, I would say nearly everybody in this room feels really strongly about what's happening in Palestine. And why is that? And why aren't we bringing that same passion to climate? I think that's a huge question for us. Like what you say about hope, I think the stories that we've heard here today there's an awful lot of hope being spoken about here today. And I do think we need to hear those, as well as, like I said earlier, be able to express hopelessness and fear, and to find a safe way of expressing that. Because I did think what you were saying, Treasa, about the fear for young people, there's just too much being put on their shoulders and their hearts for them to carry, and they're carrying something for all of us. And sorry, just the other thing I was thinking when people were talking is Rachel Carson's book. It came out, I was born in 1961. It came out either the year before or the year after I was born. It was a game changer, and yet it's only now that we're taking on some of what she was drawing attention to back then. So it's so slow. And I think, what you said about the fossil fuel industry and capitalism, that has to be part of this story, that we're up against huge power, huge power. So I think all these little things that we're doing do matter, but how do we, get it past, specific things to a groundswell, like we have about Palestine in Ireland today? I think there are good examples.
I mean, Kevin, can storytelling combat power and money? Because at the end of the day, it is the case, isn't it? I mean, I was listening this morning to discussions about Gatwick and all the different runways they want to build and all the rest, and you're thinking, how is it that we are here with a situation where you want to expand the amount of fossil fuels that have been burnt? I mean, where is the conversation, which is, of course, we can't possibly do this and keep to, at this stage, 2.53 degrees. I mean, in some ways, it speaks of how far away we are to even beginning to think about the kind of action that needs to happen.
Yeah, I think it's so difficult to counter the fossil fuel sector. Let's be honest about it. When they're in a conservative estimate, they're probably spending $1 billion in terms of the American political system, in terms of lobbying. I've seen all the figures of Ireland that, and then they're being so facilitated, and then you can see how that narrative contaminates the rest of the world, and then you can hear it in conversations in Ireland about energy security. And the one thing that really gives me hope is the economic argument for renewables. And you do need to support the market, and you do need to have proper, meaningful options. But the economics of solar combined with wind, combined with battery storage are compelling. And there's no sort of misinformation that can override that. And I think that's the one thing that will reassert itself constantly. Look at how solar has been adopted in Ireland. Like, I remember when I started writing about renewable energy, in my early years with the Irish Times, they said that solar would never happen in Ireland. And then we suddenly realized that actually we could have more solar equivalent than Germany. And then it took off, and people get the economics of it. But when you have that sort of power, that ability to contaminate the space with information that is clearly false, it's so hard to override that. And I genuinely believe it's when you come back to the local and the individual, that then you build out from there. And that's why for example, in Dingle, you have farmers that are embracing solar to a remarkable extent. And I'm not talking about Dingle the town, but Dingle Peninsula. They get it, they get the economics of it. But unfortunately, then you have a scenario, I'll finish on this, but you have another scenario where conversation becomes toxic too quickly. And I think that's what happens around land use and agriculture in Ireland. And I know really good climate and energy experts who just won't engage in the conversation anymore because they think, it's almost impossible in the sense that we can't, progress matters. And I know
Because it's become such a culture war.
Yeah, but I think Eamon Ryan used to say that the only way to solve this is to get all the stakeholders and all the representative organizations into a room and lock the room. And if it takes 3 months for them to come out with a land use plan, well and good. Do you know what I mean? And I know things don't speak for you, but do you know what I mean? That it's a bit like social progress that we always knew that we'd come up with something. And it was tortuous and painful, but I think that has to be the platform to build out from.
Can I just ask you while you're there, Kevin, because of your immense experience in this, about I'm more than willing to talk about the failures of the media, of which it's been catastrophic in many ways, but the failure of scientists, for a minute, to be more willing early on to come out and say it as it is. Do you think that, I'm thinking about all those years ago when they could have been less cautious, not so conservative, and more willing, on the theme of what we're talking about today, more willing to tell the stories of the consequences of what the data was telling them. Do you think that they should hold a bit of responsibility about that?
Undoubtedly.
And still today?
Undoubtedly so. And I think there was an old-fashioned notion that dominated that data could speak for itself. And you still get that. And I can look back on controversies over the last 7-8 years, which I really specialise in climate issues, where there was just a lone person that was defending the science. Peter Thorne, for quite an extended period, was the only guy who was frank enough to say, look, this is going in the wrong direction. And fair dues to him, he was, because he had the platform of the intergovernmental platform for climate change, his credibility couldn't be questioned. But like, if you ask the question, how many other scientists are coming up through that channel? I can't recognize any, which is appalling, really, because this is where you have to interpret science. This is where you have to get international buy-in. This is where you have to get mass action. And we have the odd person that will raise their head and be brave enough to say, this is what I see, and this is what we have to do. This is what we can do. In terms of the Irish context, and I'm afraid, there's not. If you ask me to say, well, there are others, but there's not people there consistently challenging the misinformation in particular, and disinformation, where there's some sinister aspects to it as well.
And I would add to that, if it's okay with you, John Sweeney from the New, I think,
John,
a very low
John,
voice,
yes,
and suffered
John,
because of it.
absolutely, yes, John,
Yeah.
and John was part of the IPCC process, but you need to have the next generation there.
Indeed,
yeah.
indeed. Treasa, can I ask you, this is not an attack on academia in any sense, and as I say, the media, I think there's a whole discussion about that as well, but in terms of the role of scientists and other academics to be part of what that storytelling is. I think scientists often feel nervous about stepping into that kind of space. But what do you think the responsibility is now? We can look back forever, but now and into the future, in terms of academics stepping up and being that voice and being prepared to be able to say in the full knowledge of the information that they see, to fill, I suppose, some of that imagination gap that might be there in the general public.
Oh, it's hard, isn't it? Academics, we just want to sit in our labs and offices and teach our students to do our research. Public engagement is really hard. It's really hard, and you need encouragement to do it, and training and charisma as well. But I think it is beholden on anyone who works from any discipline who works on climate crisis to try and do some public engagement, to try and reach out to broader communities. And there are avenues through which you can do that, right? And this is why I mentioned the Earth Institute. And I used to work in the UK, and it was just so amazing to come back to Ireland, to come work at UCD and to see the work the Earth Institute is doing, and bringing together people from all different kinds of disciplines and encouraging cross-disciplinary conversations. And that's what we need. And they have a team as well who are experts at communication as well and public engagement, because God knows I'm not. Right? My happy place is in the classroom or in the lecture hall. And that's what we need more of, right? We need more of those kind of cross-disciplinary spaces where they're putting people together who want to talk to one another from different disciplines, where they're trying to encourage them to get in touch with people, to give them proper media training, give them communications training. As somebody who works in the humanities, I mean, it's very rare for me to engage with a scientist, right, to tell them and to have the opportunity to tell them why literature matters, why culture matters, why storytelling matters, and how it is we can give shape, right, to these kinds of narratives, and how is it we connect with as many different audiences as possible. But I'm getting those opportunities now, and I'm getting them because of institutes like the Earth Institute, and because some of the new generation, I think, scientists who are coming in want to have those conversations too. And we've got interdisciplinary degrees now as well. Sorry, this is a bit dry, but it's really important. So we've got like a sustainability degree in UCD, and there's loads of different pathways. There's a science pathway, there's a pathway through social policy and law, there's a pathway through commerce. Maybe someday there'll be a humanities pathway. I can only hope and dream. But I get to teach on that sometimes, and it's like I get to be in the classroom and I get to tell the next generation of scientists why it is that they should listen to me, and why it is that unless we have conversations around how we communicate climate action and action, that we're never going to shift the dial. To show them some of that research too. So I look at scientific papers around it, and the research shows that if you give audiences lots of different kinds of climate stories across lots of different genres, so that includes the stuff I read, novels, the highbrow poems, whatever, but also TV shows, films, podcasts, newspapers, right? If the messaging is coming out in lots and lots of different media, in lots of different genres too, right? Again, some of it's hopeful, some of it's dystopian, some of it's realist, some of it's memoir, right? It's lots and lots of different forms. That what you see then in audiences is that they pick up on the importance of the messaging, and they don't fatigue out, so they don't burn out because all they're hearing is one particular kind of story, one particular kind of narrative. So the plenitude of messaging, it's using a plenitude of different media, it's using a plenitude of different stories, and then you see messaging start to stick. Right, but again, I'm thinking, what is the ecosystem for that messaging? How is it that we're funding more journalists who kind of bridge the gap between environmental science and communications, more artists as well, more of those interdisciplinary spaces where scientists, communication experts, humanities scholars, and so on, and brings together. Like, how do we do that kind of work? It can't just happen on a shoestring, and we can't just assume that this kind of work is going to happen innately because people are interested, right? We need to find those spaces, we need to find that funding as well.
Thank you. Jane Treasa mentioned something in there about the idea of messages sticking. And I just wonder, in your work, in your poetry, and particularly the set of poems that was commissioned by Molly here, has there been any surprise to you about the kind of images that you so beautifully and uniquely create that do stick with the public and with your readers?
Yeah, there are surprises. I mean, for example, there's a poem, Recipe for a Bog, which, you know, is now being used all over the world where they're doing bog restoration. And it's been used as, it's like, because it is a recipe, it's been used in a kind of a fun way, but it's also been used with getting other writers to look at, it's like a kind of a model for how other writers can write about any other type of nature restoration in that kind of a way. So that's the kind of surprise, that one small little poem from here, based on a bog in Wicklow, can, you know, travel far and wide. It's that kind of thing. But I suppose as well, like, I never wanted to be a poet just for other poets. I always wanted to be a poet for the public, the general public. And that's kind of a wonder. Every time it happens, I would say more of my audiences are outside of poetry. you know, or my, you know, the events I get asked to do and everything. That to me really matters. So I think it is that thing of how do we get, you know, because poetry is seen as rarefied and it's seen as for the bookshelves and everything. But I see that what I'm doing, what others are doing, is just working alongside the ecologist. It's working alongside the person in their Wellingtons and the ball. It's another way of doing it.
I mean,
It's another way of telling the story.
partly speaks to your poetry, which is so you read it and it is so relatable and yet so immensely complicated to write itself. I mean, it's sort of deceptively, it looks much more simple than it is, shall we say, and it's people relate to it. I've been in readings where it taps into an emotion and a memory, a kind of universal memory that people have. Do you see yourself as an activist at this stage?
Yeah, I do. Like, and I mean, just to say as well, my background was community development. I started as a community worker in the North Inner City. So, you know, politics were always really important to me, politics in that small p way. So, but it has amazed me because then you see, I studied English in Trinity and I saw, all I wanted to do was get out of college and do real things, you know, activism, because I got fed up with literature. And then in my 40s, I started writing poetry and I find myself back in activism again through poetry. But I'm thrilled about that. I'm really, really happy about that. That if I can make any difference, if I can help what Ricky's doing, if what I'm doing helps what he's doing, or if it helps what Burn Bio are doing, like that's, for me, that's just wonderful.
It's the collective carrying of a particular message.
It's collective. I just think the collaborative is the thing. I think that's what we have to keep thinking about. Who else can we bring with us on this journey, and how can we keep working with others? That's every bit of social change. If you think, you know, think feminism, think, you know, marriage equality, think of whatever, it's always been people working together. And so we have to do the same across our differences, you know. Yeah, so that's it.
Ricky, do you think we've got time for all of this? Do we have time for storytelling?
Yeah, we have.
It obviously takes time. It takes time, as you know, to speak to people about the change in the way we need to see the bogs themselves. That is not an overnight process.
No, but the collaboration takes time, and that's why a lot of people don't do it. And since I started working, whenever I was 17, 18, like society has changed. Like, you have to be busy now to be important. Like we measure each other in how busy we are. All the conversations I have, 90% of conversations I have every day, well, like, how are you? Busy. I'm busy. I think you feel you have to get it off your chest that I am as busy as you are. And so I think actually the best stuff does when you slow down and make time for it. And I think, look, since the Industrial Revolution, basically we've been destroying the planet. I think we've all agreed on that. So I think a little bit of extra time and flexibility will deliver better impact and more impact than rushing things. And I see it in the council, and we just rush stuff to get it done, pick the box, move to the next grant. And it's pretty disappointing. And the ones you slow down on are the ones that go bad and awry and actually have to get pushed into the following year. Initially you think, oh God, I look like a bit of sack now. But the next time round, it actually turns out much better. And I see my counterparts in other counties rushing to get their biodiversity action plans out, you know. And I mean, you know, at the end of the day, they're just words on paper. Actually, what people want to see is boots on the ground and stuff happening. And from a local authority point of view, is we can't be talking out both sides of our mouth. So it takes a little bit of culture change. I can't be telling the farmers over there or the community over there to do this when we're not doing it ourselves in Offaly County Council. So there's a little bit, so there's probably there is a bit of a delay where people think, oh, these biodiversity are going to hit the ground running and they're going to change everything. But there's a little internal cultural thing which is going to take time before we can start, because by our culture, local authorities are a very they have to be careful in what to say and conservative, because I'll give you a good example, and Patrick gets this to be here, but she's not here. But when I was still with Birdwatch Ireland, we did a project called Swift Bricks, which are swift nest sites in, you know, in the new library in Portreach Town Centre. And I stood beside her when we both did the same tweet, same photos, same tweet. And she did it from Laois County Council perspective, she was the heritage officer at the time. She's like, brilliant, have new SWIFT breaks in, the new Laois Public Library, blah, 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 great combination for SWIFTs. I did the very same one from the Burbage Island one. Her first 3 replies were about, fuck's sake, Laois County Council spending money on this shite and we should be housing humans. The first 7 responses on the Burbage Island, this is brilliant, fantastic, where can we give you more money, fair play to Laois County Council? Because our audience was already converted. Whereas everyone's just out to get the local authority. So for that reason, we're very conservative. So I spent the last 3 months trying to get permission to build a bat roost house in Eden Derry because I was so afraid of turning to the next Kildare bike shed. So, you know, so things take time and things have to be done time.
And Kevin, that speaks in some ways against what you were saying earlier, which was there's loads of energy on the ground and we all have those examples in our head, but is it the fact that that's not the case? Is it that the people in power are able to galvanize and organize quickly to stop certain things from happening and change the narrative?
Yeah, it's so complicated, this, and you highlighted it in one story. The problem is, I agree with you that strategically we have to be meticulous about what we do, but on the other hand, if you look beyond the local, we don't have time, and that's the terrible thing about it. And I'm of the view that we have to be shaken out of our comfort zones to really do the action at scale, and that's not very nice for some people. So there's a bit of a conflict there, but I've no doubt that there's ways of having a conversation that can progress quite quickly. And I do have another, just touching back to what you said about, you know, the Irish psyche, and that I think Irish people at the back of it all really want to make a meaningful collective response. And I see that everywhere, and I think it's something to do with the fact that we're all really close to land, and that's in our psyche.
So why isn't it happening?
I think politics is a huge issue, I have to say. I think the electoral cycle of 4 or 5 years is appallingly restrictive in terms of meaningful collective action for decades to come. And goes back to what several of the panel have been saying about fear to do things. So it's bizarre, because if I speak to certain politicians right up to the Taoiseach level, they get it, they understand it. Like Micheál Martin speaking like the Green Party and climbing cops there for the last few years, you know, so he knew exactly what was required. And he's so frustrated about renewable energy at the moment, you know, in terms of delivery. But there's a systemic blockage. It manifests itself in individual departments, I have to say. There's a lack of resources in many instances. And yet, despite all that, there are obvious solutions. They're not highly complex, they're doable, and yet we just need to progress that sort of at that edge.
I mean, you don't need to believe in anything to do with climate change if you have cheap energy.
Yeah, exactly, and that's going to,
which is what everyone wants.
People's lives.
Yeah.
That goes back to my earlier point about the environment. And I just on the issue of a healthy environment, I think that's the great lever for action. I think that entitlement, and if you talk to Irish people about does a river have an entitlement, they would say, well, invariably, I think yes. And that's, to be in that place of understanding is quite remarkable in comparison to other parts of the world. So it's a question of how you harness all that. And I think it's something that you touched on, Treasa, in terms of young people do get it, which is very reassuring, I have to say. But it's a question of how you knit all that together. And I'm afraid I'm still wrestling with that question myself.
And very briefly, Kevin, with regard to the media's responsibility, and I think it's fair to say there's been a catastrophic failure of the media in the last few decades to grasp and to communicate. But today, and I'm thinking in particular not of people like yourself whose job it is to communicate this, but people like political correspondents who in some ways need to have a pair of glasses on through which they see everything in through the climate and nature lens, because everything is now about that.
Yeah.
But they are not doing that. They are not having the discussions around the table. It's not what you hear on the radio about, you know, who's going to run in the presidential election and all this kind of stuff. We have to have a bit of that. But it seems to me that we're still very siloed in the media when it comes to what is an absolute existential crisis facing all of us.
Yeah, and unfortunately, you have the politicians who are locked in an electoral cycle of 4 to 5 years, and then you have the political correspondents who are locked in a cycle of 4 or 5 days. You know, what the concrete going to rub tomorrow? Do we have every aspect of it in terms of coverage? Where is it going to go? And it's incredible the extent to which that is just across every form of media almost. That's the psyche of you know, this is the most thing that matters at this. Okay, it might at this particular juncture, but in terms of the broader strategic policy, it just gets pushed out all the time.
Because there is an argument, isn't there, in the media that you do what the BBC has done and did quite early on, which is have a unit for climate, you know.
Yeah.
But the problem is that you're still in your silos.
Yeah.
I mean, climate now is deeply, in some ways you could argue it is only political, because that's what's stopping action from happening.
Yeah, and I've always tried to fight this argument in the Irish Times that everyone would have to write about climate, absolutely everyone. And that actually, in fairness to the Irish Times, that's beginning to happen. It's not where at the level I would require, but it's beginning to happen. But and also related to your earlier point, I don't think you can write an economic analysis of Ireland without referring to climate, and it's amazing how often we see economic analysis that just doesn't refer to the climate issue at all. And some of the eminent writers as well, and I think that conversation has to be had as well. But I still think after all of that, it's still doable, and then you factor in the climate solutions that are out there. That's still doable, you know, even at this very late stage. So I think that's where we have to concentrate. There's a core of fire of hope there to build on. But how we do it, I just don't know.
Treasa, I just wonder if sometimes I wonder if the lack of action is because of the unbelievable sense of hope and optimism that humanity has about things like technology. And that actually, using that lovely phrase, will be grand, is the core of all of it, which is to say, do you know what? It's all actually going to be all right. You know, it will pass 2050, where some sort of apocalypse might happen, but technology will help us through. And sure, there's always other planets to live on. And that actually, at the base of that is a phenomenal sense of hope.
Yeah. Yeah, and techno optimism, like, you know, we teach kind of climate narratives to our undergrads, where that's one of the ones we warn them about. Techno utopianism, the sense that technology will save us all. Holly G's book had a great book a few years ago on geoengineering, all these crazy geoengineering plans that are being proposed as a solution to climate crisis. So, you know, throwing different kind of sulfides into the air to reflect back the sun's rays, or building a different kind of shield out in space, again, to reflect back the sun's rays, or cloud seeding and so on, or even carbon capture. And like, so many of these are pie in the sky, and the ones that have been trialed are just like too expensive to run. They're like dismal failures. And I think we need to kind of separate out. It's really hard to separate out the narratives that are predominant on the social media, which is so prone to mis and disinformation, right? And it's in the hands of very few power players, in whose interest it is to keep swinging the narrative back towards forms of techno-utopianism, which has a very direct correlation to the shares of some really big tech companies, right? And to not assume that that's the dominant narrative that's guiding people's attitudes and behaviors as well, right? So to try and think a bit between, like, where are these narratives circulating, right? Is it online? Is it on particular social media platforms? Okay, what narratives are actually circulating amongst the undergraduates who are sitting in front of me? Like, how are they consuming narrative, and how are they communicating this to one another? I think a bit in terms of those different spheres of storytelling, right, and those different bubbles, and to think about, like, what are the dominant narratives that are kind of conditioning them, and just to try and split it apart that way. But yeah, I kind of think of it as distraction. I think of these narratives as distraction ultimately, because they're like these techno-utopian narratives. They're just that, they're utopian in the most fictional kind of way possible. And I think it's just finding ways through which, again, we can fund and resource good journalism and good narratives and storytelling that can kind of puncture those bubbles and offer alternatives and offer not kind of techno-dystopian narratives, but at least other kind of forms of scenario modeling, scenario building, generating different kinds of empathy, right? And that is the main power of storytelling, is forms of identification, empathy building, putting people on different narrative points of view, puncturing that sense of kind of power, prestige that comes with those kinds of narratives. Yeah.
Ricky, can we just talk very briefly about the Abbey League Spog project? Because I think in terms of a positive narrative, there was a fork in the road in the year 2000, where that was going to be a story of sort of abstraction and destruction, or it was going to be a story of creation and community. And unbelievably, this group of people came together who seemed to agree in nothing but the one thing, which was, we want this bog to remain as it is. And they closed the gates and they did what they did, and they said, you're not coming into Bordemona, and the rest is what it is, which is that it's an internationally renowned example of what communities can do. But what was interesting, I think, about that story was that at the start, it wasn't necessarily about carbon and nature. It was about a lot of other things, including air quality. You know, it was about something completely different to what the story is now.
The full truth is that it galvanized the community around the loss of the site, because the rumour was that once Bordemona had finished. Now, Bordemona at the time, you have to remember, are the biggest employers in that county, and they're heroic. Everyone had uncles and granddads and dads in the place. Abbey League was slightly different. They had a different sort of economic maybe outlook than other Midland towns. However, the rumour went that once Bordemona had dug a big hole in the peat, that Laois County Council would take it over as a landfill site. Yeah. So nobody wanted that. And then that galvanised everyone from the upper echelons of society right down to, you know, the poor people that live nearby. And everyone blocked it, and it came, and then there was years of barging over and back, and eventually then another sort of the stars aligned again when there was a coalition government with the Green thing, and there was a conversation had locally, and the word got to the right people, and then the lease came about, and the rest is history. We all know about it. Now there's another thing, and Helen's finding out where these bogs are located isn't always very you know, easy to get to and workable for communities. Abbey League Bog, if you haven't been there, is right on the edge of the car park of the hotel on the edge of town. You couldn't put a bog in a better place for visitors. Or to pull up there with a trailer full of materials and active retired guys to run around all the Saturday and do stuff and do this. But again, it was back. Look, it's a wonderful story. Can it be done at scale? Yes. Are there people doing it at scale? Yes. But it goes back to this land policy, what we're going to do with it, and land policy. And there's going to have to be very difficult conversations about, are we going to leave Leitrim swimming in conifers? Is Offaly going to be the wind turbine, you know, capital of the world? Is North Tipperary, Kenny, going to be the solar panel capital of the world? Nobody necessarily wants that stuff in their backyard, but at some stage, someone is going to have to get out. Are we going to put all the dairy down in Cork and poison those rivers? You know, and who's going to get the nice bit? Is it Wicklow? Or is there enough wealth around Wicklow and Dublin that we keep Wicklow as our little window into wilderness, and the rest just gets divvied up? It's really complex, and it's frightening, really. And I suppose the whole conversation keeps looping around the whole. And you asked me about time as well. If we don't have whole, there's absolutely no point. None of us would have come here today. We wouldn't have got out of bed this morning. So it all hinges on that, really.
And Jane, I think the thing that is so helpful about Abbey League is not just that it happened and that you have this amazing rejuvenation of life and all the rest, but that it offers that hope. It is a story that can be told, that gives people hope, that they can hear it and they can see it and think in their communities, well, I now have a bog and something's going to happen to that bog. I'm not too sure what it is. But if all those people who didn't agree on anything but one thing could come together and do something, I can do that too. And that's what storytelling does. It empowers people to think and to imagine that that can be the same for them.
Exactly, and but even like say at the moment in the States where what's happening there, say with ICE, is so scary and then you hear about in Los Angeles how in the neighborhood all these people get together and stop the ICE officers coming in and grabbing people. Like that's another story. I know it's not inclined, but I'm just saying that's the kind of thing that gives you hope. So we just need more and more of those kind of stories, but we also need, I do think, like what both of you said about land policy, it's so interesting, what you're saying. I've heard a little bit about that before. I wouldn't know much about it. But, the things like that we need, how do we get that out? That's kind of boring, land policy. How do we make that something that will engage people? Because the land really matters to us as Irish people, and that's why we care so much about Palestine and we identify with it. So I think we need to make those kind of links as well. And even what Ricky said about what Bordnamona could do about wetland, he said we could be the leader in the world. And I thought, well, now there's another story. That's the kind of thing that motivates people, and that motivates politicians as well. And isn't it? How do we get motivation at all those levels? How do we not say, "Oh, the politicians are all corrupt"? We have to bring everybody into the room, talking together. And in even what you said about Micheál Martin, that was interesting for me to hear, that he does know and he does care and all that. This is these are the stories. It's not just the story about the bread piece. It's that kind of variety of stories we've had today that I think gives hope.
Super. Okay, well, we might go to the audience. One thing about the Abbey League thing, just to say, I recorded that story for radio a couple of months ago, and we put it out on Countrywide. And in it, one of the people that stood at the gates, a throwaway comment said that when they put the big machine to stop the Bordnamona people from coming in, the key was lost. And I said, "Oh, who's got the key?" And whatever. It was just a throwaway thing. Literally, the only thing that people remembered from that entire report, which we're trying to give hope to communities about climate and nature, was Ella, who had the key. It was very interesting to think about what messages stick.